Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for a bit of a conversation about International Youth Day and the amazing work that you guys are doing. If we could start off maybe just by introducing Anika and Nick and talking a little bit about what you do. So Anika, if you want to go first and just tell us who you are and what the work is that you do.
Hi everyone, so my name is Dr. Anika Walia. I am the founder of Anika Food Charity, which is a food bank, and I'm also the founder of Anika Baby Bank, which is a baby bank. So we work as a collaborative network providing surplus food, toiletries, essentials to those who need it.
Amazing, thank you so much. And Nick, just the same for you as well, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Nicholas Kee. I'm co-founder and CEO for Kee Farms. We're a regenerative ocean farm based in Jamaica, and we grow seaweed and oysters, and we also train fishermen on how to create their own sustainable ocean farms.
Amazing, thank you so much.
Thanks. So I'm gonna hop in now because I have a couple of questions related to International Youth Day. So this year, the theme for International Youth Day is transforming food systems, youth innovation for human and planetary health. I think there were a few reasons why they picked this, but I think one of the key ones was seeing how the food systems really suffered through COVID-19. I know, Anika, yours will have been significantly kind of impacted by that. But Nicholas, I wonder if, go to Anika first, but I wonder if with yours, COVID was a bit of a light bulb moment or you learned anything through that process. So Anika.
So with my charity, as I said before, we give a lot of surplus food and toiletries and essentials to those who need it. And those essentials can vary, you know, from the baby bank to nappies, baby wipes, baby food, baby milk. And for other essentials, it could sometimes be saucepans, dishes, just basic everyday things that people need. And unfortunately, not many of them can afford or have access to. So during COVID, when there was a lot of panic buying, rush buying, there was a lot of demand, but not enough supply. So I remember receiving so many texts and calls and emails asking for just everyday basic essentials. And then there came a point where even our supply was really low, and we had to reach out extensively and just try to organize things. For example, simple things like blankets, quilts, people were struggling to buy that. Toilet rolls was obviously quite a common request. So just grabbing it from different resources and trying to give it to those who needed it. But I think also with COVID-19, it was the marginalized that were hit the most. There's no doubt about it, because they were already struggling before COVID-19 hit. So after COVID-19, things became so much more worse, especially when the access to basic essential things were cut off. And then because of we had the ruling distance, a 5-meter ruling, and there were a lot of charities that also close to me that people go indoors to and personally go and see that were closed because they couldn't have people that were, so we didn't know at that time who was infected, who wasn't infected. So a lot of the help that they normally receive on a weekly and daily basis was also cut off. So we do, for example, a lot of group discussions, life support classes as well. And we help a range of people from refugee seekers, asylum seekers, domestic violence survivors, single mothers, newborn children. So we were helping so many people. And then because of COVID, we couldn't see them personally with person. So a lot of these classes and support was transferred on Zoom, but I feel like you lose a sort of personal face-to-face interaction and you actually being there in person for that person. So we managed to find ways around it and thankfully get through it, and like leaving the food outside. I remember a lot of the people that we were giving food to, I received texts that, look, I've actually got COVID-19 and I can't leave my room, because a lot of them were in homeless hostels. So they couldn't go outside and they didn't have the support of their family or friends to be able to provide them with food. So we were making warm meals and just leaving it outside their room doors so that they could eat. Yeah. And we were lucky that people could have come to us, but I'm sure that there were some people who were in these homeless hostels who didn't have friends or families who could actually go out and buy stuff for them.
Yeah. In terms of, food systems and the link with nutrition, what were the kind of things that you were seeing or hearing, Anika, from those you were working with in terms of how how it impacted the kind of food they were eating or impact on health? Specifically, I wonder if, those who actually had COVID, what kind of food they were getting to eat in terms of healthy nutrition and that kind of thing.
So we have access to fresh supply of food, but during COVID, we couldn't have that supply. So it was mainly tinned cans, tinned meals, ready meals, but even the ready meals were so much in short supply. I remember having to ask somebody, look, can we have some sandwiches? There were no sandwiches. So the diet and nutrition actually became very limited. Even with our baby bank, there were a lot of people asking for baby milk. And that was really worrying to me, that they couldn't have access to baby milk and baby food. So I know that the adults' diets, it's just very, very restricted. And it was mainly all tinned, packed food, because any fresh food they couldn't have access to. So yeah, it was very, very hard.
Thanks, Anika. And what about you, Nicholas? How did COVID impact kind of the way you thought about food systems, and what did you witness during that time?
Yeah, so I guess in our respect, COVID kind of provided like a layer or a blanket for the government and I guess private institutions to do a lot of the dirty work to distract us from the major problems that we're facing. So within the context of like my work, for instance, what had started to happen was that hoteliers were clearing out acres, like dozens of acres of mangroves, and destroying natural habitats that would enable the population and growth of fish, which is what we heavily rely on. And so there were other instances of just mining companies coming on land and basically destroying habitats and dumping the waste into the ocean, killing thousands of fish that would have served as like catch for fishermen to sell and eat for an entire quarter. So it's things like that that kind of disrupted, that COVID kind of hid under the radar, or at least from the general public. And so even though we had the overfishing issue from before, things have amplified a bit, but it's of no, I guess, it isn't because of the fishermen themselves. It's more or less the systems at play.
That's really interesting. I hadn't realized that it was, COVID not even as a direct impact, but kind of a secondary impact of the world's attention is elsewhere. What can we get away with, and that kind of knock on. So just going back to the theme of International Youth Day, it was looking at human and planetary health. In terms of yours then, Nicholas, yours is really specifically looking at how that food system can benefit the planet. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah. So we essentially focus on seaweed and oysters. And typically, seaweed isn't, I guess, the sexiest or the most mainstream palatable thing that one would think of when they think of, I guess, food that they would eat regularly. Aside from probably Eastern countries and regions. But in the West, we don't typically use seaweed in that way. We probably use it for its byproducts along the value chain, which is fine, but seaweed for sure is honestly probably our best way forward. Not just macroalgae that we see on the beach, but also microalgae that we can probably turn into food products like spirulina that you drink. Seaweed provides like a whole lot of minerals and nutrients that a lot of people are missing, and a lot of people don't realize that we get a lot of, and a lot of people don't really realize that we actually get a whole lot of our nutrients and minerals from seaweed, vicariously of like the fish that we actually eat. So like cod liver oil, for instance, it's really seaweed. It's just seaweed that the fish eat that we more or less extract from the fish, which could just essentially be extracted from seaweed itself, or even just using seaweed for, you know, other replacements, healthier replacements like pasta, seaweed pasta, or just turning it into snacks. But it really highlights, I guess, a shift in food lifestyle that is probably required for us to not just live healthier as humans, but be more respectful to the planet.
Yeah, that was one that really surprised me, actually. I remember reading about that, of, you know, we grow up with this cod liver oil. We know it's really good for omega, and we're told that. And we all just go, well, yeah, the cod makes it in their liver. And then you read a bit and you're like, no, it's the algae and the seaweed that they eat, and they just kind of convert it and then they get it out of there. So it's, yeah, that was fascinating, because the article was about vegan alternatives, and it was like, this isn't a vegan alternative, this was the vegan original. We just circumnavigated it. And there's, when we talk about our food systems and the kind of food that we eat in this world, where we are very heavily processed, and there does seem to be small trends away from that. But yeah, a lot of the things aren't kind of, as International Youth Day is talking about innovation, they're not even new innovations, they're almost reverse innovations. So that whole thing around unlearning, what do we have to unlearn, because maybe as humans we've been a little too clever, and are being a bit too clever is having such an impact on the environment and all other areas of our life. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
But also we just haven't been paying attention to the research on just seaweed. There's just like a huge gap with respect to other alternate food sources. Seaweed is not really paid attention to, and so now it's kind of making it's making a comeback, is what I would say.
I think maybe you need to, instead of I've heard you say that a couple of times, seaweed isn't sexy. Maybe you need to flip that, and that has to be like the Kee Industries new logo. Seaweed is sexy. With badges. So just talking in terms of the eco side of it, going back to you, Anika, you mentioned kind of at this point your fresh food is being blocked. It's a lot more tins, packages, all that kind of thing, in terms of the environmental impact and how you're managing the waste from that. Is that kind of anything that your food banks have seen, that there's kind of impacts with more waste, people are less able to dispose of things, or you're having to rely on packaged items a lot more?
We're definitely having to rely more on packaged items, but regarding food wastage, there has been so much of that, especially pre-COVID and even after COVID. There is so much. For example, in the United Kingdom, I mean, if I just give some statistics here, the UK spends the UK wastes 9.7 billion pounds of food every year. 9.7 billion pounds of food, when we have so many people that are hungry. In London alone, there's 1.5 million adults struggling to eat. Every single day in the United Kingdom, there are 400,000 children at risk of not eating their next meal. And yet we're wasting 9.7 billion pounds of food. 3.6 million tons of food is being wasted every year. And out of that 3.6 million tons, over 2 million tons is edible food that people can eat. And that's why food wastage is something that's so important to me, and that our charity aims to campaign for continuously, because so much is being wasted, and a lot of that wastage food could have helped so many people, especially during COVID. But again, it's still being wasted. Yeah. I mean, I've seen, I'm not going to name the supermarket, but there is this one supermarket where I have personally seen where, because they don't want to hand it out to charity because they feel like it's too much work having to order and go through all the food. And I personally volunteered. I said, look, I will come in, I'll do everything, it's fine. Mm-hmm. And I've seen them literally throw away a truck full of fresh edible food.
Mm-hmm.
There is so much of that that's being wasted, and this fresh food, it ends up in the landfills, so it's taking up space, and it's also contributing to global warming.
Yeah.
Food wastage in total contributes to 8% of the carbon greenhouse effect.
Mm-hmm.
So it has so many effects globally, food wastage. It's not just one problem. It leads to food poverty, it leads to food insecurity, it leads to global warming. It's taking up space in the landfill that we don't have. And there's unfortunately not enough media attention on it. People always seem to focus on, look, there are people that are not eating because the benefits are being cut off and this is being cut off. Yes, that's true. But we do have a solution to these problems. We have a solution to food poverty and food insecurity by taking the food wastage that we have and making sure it goes to the right people, such as soup kitchens, food banks, charities that can then give it to their network of people.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of food wastage that's happening, a lot.
There's an activist called Mark Boyle who did a whole series of kind of, these sort of events and wrote a couple of books trying to highlight that food wastage. I think he did a couple of events where they fed 1,000 people in Bristol lunch one day just by kind of ringing up and getting people to donate, and they got that food in one day just to cook and feed, and it was nothing was pre-ordered. It was what was going to be, going in the bin and you're right, it's a huge issue, and maybe this is where there needs to be a bit of change of leadership, and maybe that's where young leaders come in, is kind of looking at things a bit differently. How do we convince the traditional power holders to make change in these areas, whether it's legislation around supermarkets, what they are and are not allowed to bin, ensuring that they stick to some kind of minimum codes of food waste reduction, or even if it's kind of more of a government-led element in terms of, so for both of you then, kind of in terms of the work that you do individually, what is the barrier to young leaders like you being able to reach these traditional power spaces that you feel could be making a change? Nicholas?
Ooh, big question. It's a number of things. I guess on the immediate front, with respect to my sector and just generally food systems, it's surprisingly the government, and I'll expound on that. So historically, what has been happening, not even just in Jamaica, but probably across the world really, is that a lot of the unsustainable food practices have been going on for just way too long, and they've been permitted by the government. I guess same thing can be said for the broader scope of like oil in relation to climate change. And so that has been kind of allowed by the government and allowed to persist. But with respect to like things relating to alternate food sources or getting things done, there's a bigger barrier, surprisingly. Like typically you'd probably have like, I don't know, like a mining operation get approval in a matter of, I don't know, weeks. For us to do anything in the ocean, in Jamaica, it takes like 6 months to get proper approval. And you have to go through about 5 different government agencies. In Europe, I know for sure that approval for doing like ocean farming takes 5 years. Typically more harmful industries, they can just, go ahead without any repercussions. The same can be said for the US. It takes on average a year to 2 to get proper approval. And outside of that, outside of the government, another issue is just lack of understanding of how, lack of trust of the science, I think. And that kind of goes into how we use water, for instance. So typically across the world, majority of our water sources are being used to help to propagate food for within the agricultural sector. This goes, into crops and also livestock. About 80 to 95% on average per country. That's the amount of water that is dedicated just to agriculture alone. That's extremely unsustainable. And nothing has really been done about it. And it has allowed to persist because governments historically have just been given a lot of leeway to allow this to happen. And it's kind of hard to innovate if a lot of leeway, this amount of leeway is given, and subsidies to encourage this kind of activity.
That's so interesting you said that about the lack of trust in science. I think I don't know if you saw the recent announcement about the global warming, I think it was yesterday or the day before it came out, in relation to COP26. And the guy was like, I should know his name. Yeah, this is your last warning. And you see how long people have been saying, yeah, the temperature's going up. You see the graph that it's not even debatable. And he's like, but we've been telling you, we're still telling you. So how do you think that youth leaders, no matter what field they're in, whether they're in food or kind of other spaces, is this a place where youth leaders can make sway in their, maybe, or not youth leaders necessarily, just youth in their voting policies and all that kind of thing? What is it that's going to help the world wake up to that, Nicholas?
Well,
tiny questions today, okay? Small, easy questions.
I've been trying for years, not just in this sector, but just in others. Two things kind of have to happen. The people in power tend to be extremely old and traditional. And so they kind of have to either wither away and leave, or we have to try to spin some clever narrative that would provide them with some incentive based on their conservative nature. I don't really know what that specifically looks like, unfortunately, but I'm continuing the fight to try to storytell in a way that will kind of allow them or force them to wake up. I think it's a bit more removed for the traditionalists, because they're kind of at the end of the road, and a lot of the issues that we're facing really won't impact them as much as it will impact us, because we have, like, maybe on average another 40 to 80 years left, and we for sure will feel a lot of the effects of many of the issues that we're facing within the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah,
severely.
So you're so right. It's like anything, you have to find out what people care about and hit them through that. And then if it's a case of that narrative has to be about the long-term financial impact as opposed to the planetary one for some people, that might be the way we have to go, or their legacy will not last because the industries they're in will not last, that kind of thing. But I'm sure we could go on for ages, and I've been neglecting Anika. Are you all right? You chatting to someone?
Yes, I am.
So yeah, in terms of kind of youth leadership in this area impacting government or those power holders, did you have anything that you wanted to comment with on that?
I think exposure is so important. Exposure, and what I mean by that is the media. I think there's a lot of information out there, but if it's not making it to the front pages, then unfortunately people are not aware of it. And when I say media, I also say social media as well, because as the generations are changing, we tend to be so much more on our phones. So social media and then traditional media, these are the places we need to come to. And regarding the people in power, I do agree with what Nicholas said. I do feel the people in power could be doing a lot more, especially the government. For example, with food wastage, something that my charity is campaigning for is for an anti-food waste law to happen in the United Kingdom. There's a similar law already in France, where what this law does, it prohibits supermarkets from throwing away any food and legally donating it to charities, soup kitchens, and to those who need it. That way we have the extra surplus of food going to those who need it. So there's a problem and then there's a solution. So I think if we can have similar laws here, that would allow that anything that's surplus to be donated. It doesn't have to be food. It could be anything else, because we have the surplus. That's a solution to the problem we have. We just need to bring the two together, and it would solve so many problems. And I think the way people can campaign about it, especially young people, would definitely be social media and traditional media to somehow find a way to come onto this, coming on to what Nicholas said about narrative, bringing your own personal story to it and just writing to them. I've been writing to them for many, many months. But it gets you somewhere. The beginning is very slow, but it does get you somewhere. So yeah, just keep trying and persisting, I guess.
Yeah, I guess to add on to Anika's point, traditionalists, or I guess as people get older, they tend to more rely on a different version of the truth. Typically, yes. I guess objective truth can be separated or just looked at into two different factions of like fact, which is data reliant, and then there's wisdom, which is based on a lot of experience. A lot of the traditionalists tend to lean more on the wisdom piece while ignoring a lot of the facts, because a lot of things have been changing and they've failed to kind of acknowledge that. But they more rely on, the wisdom piece of the truth because it's either convenient or it just makes more sense to them because it's just always how they've been doing things, and which is, I guess, somewhat understandable. In the age of the internet, and just technology generally, we have a surplus of fact-based data that we can rely on to make things more optimal and make them better and make them more sustainable.
You're absolutely smashing it today, Nick. All these things that are like that fact-based and wisdom-based is so fascinating. And actually, we are thinking at QCT about how we look into more, the benefit of intergenerational relationships in these change-making or kind of areas. And I think that's a really, really fascinating thing. So maybe we'll have another chat about that. But I think also what you said about there's an abundance of fact, there's also an abundance of what was Trump's word? What did he come up with?
Oh, fake news. Yeah, right.
Fake news. And that's a whole skill, I think, that the very young and the older, they haven't learned necessarily that kind of, how do you filter this massive information? My little niece was saying something and she said, blah, 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 and this happened. And I was like, I don't think that's true. And she's like, it was on YouTube. And I was like, okay, we need to have a chat about YouTube and sources. But yeah, I think you're right. There's a big one in there. I have one last question for you all, and then I'm going to hand over to Hannah. It's a quick one. So my question is, as this is International Youth Day, and we're talking about food systems, young people, innovation, if you could ask other young people to do one thing today that would help make a tiny impact, or one thing they might want to take up doing each week. Is there anything small that could make an impact with lots and lots of people doing it that you could recommend to anyone watching?
I think with food, for example, or not just food, but any items, just donate it to your local charity, food bank or baby bank. It could be something as simple, as a can of beans that would make somebody's dinner. It could be like a small teddy bear that would, make a child very happy. So just donate something small that you don't need or that's just lying around in your house. Because there's so many people that have things like everyday basic things that they don't use, that are just lying around in their homes. And more often than not, sometimes it ends up in the dustbin. So just like a small thing that you're not using or you don't need, just donate it.
That's a really good one. Actually, we have in hometown in Dundee, have a kind of community larder where anyone, so not just kind of shops do donate their kind of flours that are getting a tiny bit brown on the edges, or bakeries leftover bread, and it's anyone can kind of put it in. It's managed, but yeah, you can also donate kind of that box of beauty sets that you got for Christmases, and they've sat in your cupboard for ages with the shampoo, conditioner, body wash, scented, all that kind of stuff. That, yeah, you're right, you do a spring clean and the automatic thing is I'll just pop that in the bin. So that's a really good one. Thanks, Anika. And what about you? What's your one thing young people could do to help turn the tide on this, Nicholas?
Oh, I have one I have one small but rippling effect one, and then I have like a radical one. I'll start with the baby one. I think young people should speak to their families, specifically their parents, about things that they're passionate about, and think that tiny speck of just implanting fact-based truth into their day will help to trickle along the spectrum of, I guess, create somewhat of a mesh network of how the parents themselves interact with other parents and other people within society, because they do have jobs, and a decent chunk of them probably have jobs or are positioned in roles that that help to shape a lot of decision-making processes. And so as young people, we kind of just need to, shift the narrative a bit, start with our parents. Once we get the opportunity to convince them, then we can move on to somebody else, and just inject a lot of, realism about what we're facing now. And I guess the radical one, young people should stop recycling and stop telling people to recycle. Stop feeding into the narrative of recycling. Only about like 9% of all of our plastics are recycled, and only 1% is actually upcycled. A lot of the recycling propaganda is more or less fed by oil companies, unfortunately. And so it can be seen as a distraction from what we actually need to do to kind of quell a lot of the climate change issues.
That's really radical, yes. And I suppose then they're saying, well, what do we do? And what do we do is we're pushing for non-single use. We're pushing for manufacturing materials that can be recycled or are biodegradable. And it's really interesting about the distraction, because I know that there's a big thing about single-use straws in the oceans, and that has been a big easy thing, no plastic straws, and it's something like 0.01% of the ocean waste, when actually a huge amount, over a third, is actually waste from fishing waste, from dumped kind of cargo and industry stuff. It's not us,
it really is a big industry.
It's a big thing. I love that. I love if we, kind of how do our young people, how does the network help just these little, in those movies where the guy pans the camera back where you're supposed to be looking. It's kind of, what are we being distracted from? So I'm going to go. You've got 15 minutes left-ish, but you can run on, up to you. For Hannah, I know she's got a couple of bits, and then if you guys had anything to ask each other. But thanks for all of those. They were brilliant. Considering I just made those questions up and threw them at you, you've done amazingly. Thanks.
Thank you, Frances.
Thank you, Frances.
Thanks, Frances. Yeah, I just wanted to touch a little bit on what Nick, I think it was, mentioned earlier about intergenerational kind of working with older generations and maybe people who have differing opinions and views. Do both of you do that regularly in your organisation? Because I know I run a charity outside of this as well, and I sometimes feel it can be a little bit echo chambery in that I work with quite a lot of young people. Just wondered if your experiences were the same, or if you kind of strive to work with cross-generationally as well.
Yeah, I guess for me, I try to sensitize everyone. Well, I think in my particular case, because there isn't, this is something that really hasn't been done at mass, and we kind of trying to educate a generation of people who have been more reliant on traditional fishing systems that they've just completely ignored this or may not have seen the opportunity there. That has been like what we've been kind of focusing on. It's just like if we get them to understand the benefits and then have them do it themselves, they'll be able to just spread the word vicariously of the network, not just through their fisher folk people, but their entire communities, and that will essentially just spread through the entire informal economy, because we actually want to encourage more people who want to get into fishing or mariculture activity. And so that is like the kinds of interactions that we more than likely need to have.
Yeah.
Very grassroots.
Great. And Anika, I don't know if your experience is similar or different.
I think it kind of varies, because when it came to food wastage and I was talking about my petition for an anti-food waste law, I found that the older generation was more supporting of it, but the younger generation wasn't. And a lot of people would think it'd be the other way around. But with the older generation that I was speaking to, for example, a lot of them had served in the war.
Yeah.
And I remember a couple of them had served in World War II, and they talked about their own experiences in the trenches and how they had survived on tin food. And because we had talked a lot about expiry dates as well. So unfortunately, food has a lot of expiry date, but the food is still edible to eat. For example, eggs, you can still eat them 2 weeks after their expiry date. So that they were talking about their own experiences. And we had an event where they were talking about how they had all this tin food and other food that they were eating that was edible and that was well past its date because they were serving in the wars. But the younger generation, the feedback I was getting that, look, the supermarkets are donating to food banks, there isn't that much food wastage. So with the older generation, I found that they were a lot more aware of it. I think they'd experienced more of it, whereas the younger generation, again, I think coming back to what Nick had said, it's just this propaganda that when supermarkets say, look, we're donating to food bank, and then that's a solution. Not all supermarkets in the United Kingdom donate to food banks, and there is still so much food wastage that unfortunately the younger generation still isn't aware of. And I think sometimes bridging this gap can be difficult. But then, once the older generation starts talking to the younger generation, because we actually held like a group support where we had people coming in and telling their stories, and at the end of it there were a lot of people from the younger generation that were like, oh, this does happen and it's on such a wide global scale and nobody knows about it. So
I think there is definitely something to be said around the visibility of what you see maybe not being the whole picture, almost like the tip of the iceberg. I think as Francis was saying with plastic straws, it's so easy to believe that narrative and believe the simplistic narrative that I can see that it's so important to kind of get the whole picture as well.
It is, because people are so unaware of the scale at which it takes place at. People seem to think that it's not that much of a big issue, but it is. And when people go and see how much food is being wasted and how hungry people are, like the people that I've interacted with, literally they have nothing. They come from nothing. I've had people who've turned up, homeless people with no clothes, nothing. And again, there's just this perception, for example, with homeless people, there's this perception that, oh, if we give them money, if we give them something, it's just going to end up on drugs or alcohol. And these are such false narratives which need to change. I remember I was speaking to this one man and I asked, just talking about how he got to being in that unfortunate state. And his wife of 45 years had passed away and they didn't have any children. It was just him and her. And he just couldn't keep up with it. He became really depressed and he couldn't keep up with his job. And it ended up with him being homeless, unfortunately. So it's just these narratives that people have that, it's not going anywhere, just going to go on drugs, stuff like that. All that needs to change. And that comes back to what you said, which is visibility. That has to change so much. People look so much at what is happening. And I think what they should be focusing on, why is it happening? That why needs to come mainstream. And once it does, hopefully it will change so many opinions.
I remember I saw, and I can't remember if somebody said it in an article or it was an illustration, but it was basically talking about how you see refugees or migrants or homeless people, and they have mobile phones. And why do they have mobile phones if they have nothing? How can they have a mobile phone? And the response was, they're refugees or they're homeless. They're not from the past. You know, it's we don't live in a world where there are telephone boxes on the corner anymore, or that, you know, you have to have a mobile, you have to be contactable, and especially if you're trying to keep in touch with families overseas. And there can be that snap judgment of,
yes,
if they can afford a phone, they don't need our money. If they can do this, they're not in trouble. And it's those kind of small biases that, yeah, I think that's so interesting.
Also with the mobile phones, again, like a lot of them don't buy it, it's given to them by the charities. And those are the really outdated old phones. So it's not like they're the smartphones or anything. It's just where they can make a call. And I know, for example, one charity, Migrant Help, they give it to them, especially to the suicidals that have suicidal intent, to make sure that they're okay and that they can get help when they need it. But these perceptions, again, like you said, they think they have a mobile phone, so they're okay when they're not.
I think some of that is also down to like sensitive media reporting, and I won't point fingers at which papers, but I think I don't need to equally, that you don't get a sympathetic narrative, you don't get a whole story if somebody's in poverty or if they're a migrant or if they're in a difficult situation. It's always the stigmatizing points and the things that are polarizing that obviously they drive news and they drive sales, but I think that contributes to this kind of 2D vision of who we think people are or should be, rather than them as kind of complex humans like everybody else.
Yeah, I agree on that. What tends to happen is that we collectively, it's very hard for us to take in complex ideas and situations. Everything needs to be simplified. And I guess for better or worse, it's a requirement, because we're not all attuned to the same interests, or we don't have the same attention span or passion towards something. So everything needs to be very palatable. And so it really is a winner of the narratives kind of game at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so promising though, having worked with the QCT network, just seeing all these stories come through and these amazing people who are in organisations who are storytelling in a way that's authentic to people's experiences is just really lovely and really kind of promising and inspiring to see. I think that kind of leads on to my last question that I have planned almost, was how, for both of you, how has being a part of the QCT network helped you in what you do? Has it helped you kind of to network and meet other like-minded people? And yeah, just if you could talk a little bit about the network and what it's done for your organisation, would be fantastic.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I met Anika, so there's that. And I've been more or less exposed to a wider network that has allowed me to kind of somewhat get out of the rut. Because typically my average day is spent trying to convince people who are for lack of better words, unconvincible in some respect. And so having a bit of, I guess, a space to either bounce ideas off of, but also just understand what other people are doing, so that I can then take some of those lessons and apply them in a cross-sectional way. I think that is probably the biggest benefit that I've had so far.
Yeah, amazing, thank you. And Anika?
I think being part of the QCT has honestly been amazing. I've met so many amazing individuals. I'm following a lot of them on Instagram as well. And I just like talking to them, messaging them and seeing the work that they are doing and how they're doing it. I think it just really makes you just more motivated as well. And it's good to be able to meet people who are trying to make as much of a difference as you are, and you know the hurdles and the problems. Even though it's different sectors, they know that, look, okay, this person's not going to come back, but keep trying. So it's good to be able to have that sort of relationship, I guess. And also with the QCT, so we also have these amazing groups. We have the Future Food Network, we have like a mental health group, and I think all these groups that emphasize and talk about all these social issues that are not being talked about, I think that's really, really good. And I've no doubt that a lot of them are going to do so, so well. So yeah, it's brought me to so many amazing people, including all of you today on this Zoom call.
Such a good ending, Anika. But you, Hannah, are also in the network. So I'm just going to make you answer that too.
I think for me, so my charity, I work with young people diagnosed with cancer. So typically I wouldn't have probably met people working in the food sector, just because it's such a different scope and different organisations. And I think it's really opened my eyes to how interconnected all of these really are. I think when I first joined the network, I'd see these as very different and separate pools of people, themes, groups, doing completely different things, but mental health relates to physical health, relates to your environment, relates to nutrition. And so I think whilst we all are very different, we're all very similar at our core. And I think QCT has been able to kind of emphasize that and bring us together and just form connections that we maybe wouldn't have ordinarily formed for ourselves. And I think sometimes you can get trapped in a little bit of an echo chamber. If you've got people around you just doing what you do, the same kind of area in the sector, you often need that one maybe odd idea or like spark of inspiration from somewhere else to just make you take a step back and reconsider your perspective and how you can work, especially with food, even how we can bring other people's work into our own to holistically kind of combat the bigger challenges as well.
Wonderful.
They're my kind of questions, but equally if you, Anika or Nicholas, have any questions for each other or for us, or even just for the wider QCT network, so when this goes live, if anybody wants to comment or continue this conversation, they're very welcome to do that as well.
Yeah, I guess for Anika, I'm curious, how much of a systematic shift have you been able to make thus far?
I've been very lucky that because my charity opened in 2018, that I've been able to make a difference in my community. Honestly, I mean, it's taken a while to partner up with different partners for our supplies and demand that we have. But with my charity, for example, we managed to donate over 15,000 of sanitary products, sanitary pads, reusable underwears. We've given over 100,000 meals. We've given almost over 40,000 toiletries. And it's just been amazing. So while I think we've grown so much, and also now people in our local community know us as well. So the shift has been happening, and we've been able to reach out to so many people. Like now, when we started out, we were providing to just very less people, but now even after the pandemic, now on average we're helping 200 people every week with meals, toiletries, essentials. So there has been a shift, and I hope that it can be more as well.
Have you been able to, I guess, intercept the supply chain in the most optimal way, you think?
I think there was a delay, but I think writing to a lot of supermarkets, their heads, conducting meetings in our local communities as well, just keeping writing to people and saying, look, this is happening, this is a problem, and also discussing it in our local community talks, and look, this does happen. So I feel that, like, for example, our food partner, one of them, for example, for food, we go to Greg's, which gives us with hot meals, and we go to supermarket, for example, Morrison's. They're just some of our charity partners, but the food that they're giving us, if we weren't there to collect it, it would have been going wasted. So I think like that, we're making a difference. So yeah, wherever it's going to be wasted, we'll be there to make sure that it's not being wasted. And if we can't be there, then we'll, you know, notify another charity that, look, this is in your area, we can't be there, but this is something that you can look at, and they also get their supply as well. So it's been small moments, but I'm just so thankful that we've grown in these past 3 years.
Do you think that I guess going deeper down the stack along the supply chain would probably be a more proactive approach? I'm just curious, like approaching the manufacturers, maybe?
I think one thing I've also spoken to a lot of people about is, especially the heads as well higher up, is the expiry dates. Because by law, a supermarket can't keep something if it's past its expiry date, even if that food is still in good condition, even if it's still edible. So they do try to tackle it. Sometimes they'll put that food item on a reduced display at the end of the evening. And if it doesn't get sold out, then unfortunately, sometimes they'll throw it away. But then we're coming in and saying, look, we'll take that as well. But I think for us, the more proactive approach is for it to happen unanimously across the United Kingdom. And I think the way that can happen, if there was more stricter legislation, as you talked about. But one thing that I'm particularly looking at is an anti-food waste law that would help make sure it goes to the direct supply networks, but also the expiry dates. I'm writing to people about that too. So hopefully something good will come out of it. You know, it's like biscuits, you know, tin cans can last up to years past the expiry date, you know, but people just throw them away when they can provide meals for somebody. So yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed.
Got you. Okay.
I do have a question for you though.
Sure.
So, I mean, I found that really interesting, the way you talked about, for example, seaweed and ocean farming and etc. So I wanted to know more of, like, how did you get into that? Like, what brought that to your attention?
Oh boy, it was really a happy accident at this point. I'd been more or less in tech for 15 years. I mean, I still am to some degree, but that's where I'm making the shift from within, I guess, my entrepreneurial journey. And at the same time, I'd been doing a lot of work with governments on policy for either climate change or unemployment and things related to technology. And within the climate change spectrum, a lot of the policy and legislation is very regulatory oriented and doesn't exactly promote a lot of progressive activity that would allow us to contribute to like the climate change fight in terms of action. And so that's when I kind of just decided to do more due diligence to understand what might be the most critical path for small island developing nations that would be the most vulnerable and at risk to climate change. And you know, carbon removal seemed like the best critical path, or the most critical. And it is more or less accessible. The more biological route is accessible if done in a network using the ocean, and people who are, you know, having people who are familiar with interacting with the ocean participate and earn from this as well. So it was the path was a bit convoluted, but yeah. And I guess to add on to that, I'm more or less kind of just injecting a lot of my past learnings into it. So like with respect to carbon, for instance, we're tokenizing carbon credits and biodiversity credits to ensure that this space is more sustainable. I'm not sure how much you know about blockchain, but but that's essentially what we're doing. We're creating a new stream or a new instrument that would be adaptable for the fishermen, not just to get into the space, but also scale at a ready pace that is competitive with everyone else.
Oh, so would that be your end goal, I suppose, in a way?
Yeah. Get as many fishermen onto the network as possible, but I mean, more immediate goal to have it be as sustainable as possible, financially sustainable and feasible. And so I'm doing that through like tokenizing something, tokenizing the sale of carbon credits and biodiversity credits and seaweed and oysters, everything related to climate.
Your past kind of experience is quite interesting in that you've covered an awful lot of areas, but most of it goes back to human behavior and psychology. And, you know, I think, I can't remember what it was called. What was the project you did about the voting project, the election project?
Oh, right. Yes. It's called, what did we call it? Not Jam COVID. I don't remember. It was basically an election app. It was an election.
It worked.
It was an election app. I don't remember the name, but we essentially provided like real-time results of counting for different members of parliament throughout the election cycle. And, you know, this was especially important because one, we couldn't really go outside and celebrate, but two, this wasn't something that was made available before. We always had to be more reliant on TV stations to give us delayed results. And I think people really appreciated the immediacy of just the results themselves and the data that kind of churned out of that. But it definitely impacted human behavior because or not impacted, but it more aligned with our present day human behavior, with our need for immediacy. And it worked out well because, you know, that's where we are right now. We're very impatient.
Thanks. I just like bringing up everybody's old work that they've forgotten about. I'm like, but that was really good. I remember.
I love, it's testament to how much that you do that you can't remember what you called something.
I'm sure. Oh gosh, I just need to look. Honestly,
check it on LinkedIn. I'm sure it's on there.
Oh, it's definitely on some website somewhere. Jamaica Decides. That's what we call it.
Decides. I remember.
And you got quite
good kind of. Did it? I can't remember exactly. I could be making this up. You tell me, but it was beneficial in terms of engagement across different kind of age groups that maybe felt less engaged.
Yeah, but also the diaspora who felt less connected from before. You know, within Jamaica, we have about 2.9 million people, but within the diaspora, it's about 3.1 million scattered across the globe. And so, yeah, it really brought this sense of community back from the older generation who happen to be from the diaspora, majority of them, and us who are here in Jamaica. But yeah.
You're all a bunch of geniuses. Hannah, I think we're probably out of time, do you think?
Yeah, to be honest, unless anybody has any kind of burning questions, I think you've both been fantastic. Amazing. And had some incredible answers. So yeah, a huge thank you for doing this and for chatting to us and giving us the opportunity to learn more about what you're doing as well.